Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives Deep Dive series, where we explore the fascinating history, culture, and geography of countries around the world. Today, we're traveling to the Caribbean to uncover the story of Antigua and Barbuda, a twin island nation where turquoise waters meet colonial history, and where centuries of resilience shaped the vibrant culture you see today. From ancient indigenous settlements and the age of sugar plantations to independence and modern identity, Antigua and Barbuda is more than just a tropical paradise. It's a crossroads of peoples and histories, with stories waiting to be told. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I love seeing how global our community is. And if you enjoy calm, story-driven explorations of history and geography, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode of Sleepy History. All right, let's set sail and begin our journey through Antigua and Barbuda. Chapter 1. Setting the Scene. Our destination is the twin island nation of Antigua and Barbuda, two jewels nestled in the heart of the Leeward Islands, floating serenely in the eastern Caribbean Sea. As you settle into your evening rest, let your mind wander with me to these peaceful islands, where time moves at the unhurried pace of ocean tides, and where every breeze carries echoes of ancient voyages, colonial settlements, and the gradual awakening of a proud nation. Imagine, if you will, standing on a gentle hillside as dusk settles over the Caribbean. The air is warm and soft, carrying the scent of frangipani and the distant sound of waves caressing coral shores. Below you stretches a landscape that has witnessed the footsteps of indigenous peoples, the sails of European explorers, the struggles and triumphs of enslaved Africans and their descendants, and ultimately, the birth of an independent Caribbean nation. Antigua and Barbuda occupy a special place in the grand tapestry of Caribbean history. These islands, separated by just 27 miles of crystal-clear water, have shared a common destiny while maintaining their own distinct characters. Antigua, the larger of the two, covers 108 square miles of gently rolling terrain, dotted with historic sugar mills and embraced by some of the world's most beautiful beaches. Barbuda, smaller and more remote, spans 62 square miles of low-lying coral limestone, a sanctuary for wildlife and a testament to nature's quiet persistence. The very names of these islands carry stories within them. Antigua derives from the Spanish Antigua, meaning ancient, bestowed upon the island by Christopher Columbus in 1493 during his second voyage to the Americas. He named it after the church of Santa Maria de la Antigua in Seville, Spain. Barbuda's name likely comes from the Spanish Los Barbados, meaning the bearded ones, possibly referring to the fig trees whose aerial roots resembled beards hanging from the branches. But long before European tongues shaped these names, the islands had their own identities. The indigenous peoples who first called these lands home knew Antigua as Waladli or Wadadli, meaning our own land. Barbuda was called Waomoni, a name that spoke to its spiritual significance in the island chain. These original names remind us that our story begins not with European discovery, but with the much older presence of peoples who had made these islands their home for thousands of years. As we embark on this gentle exploration together, we'll discover how geography has shaped human destiny in these islands. We'll learn how the coral limestone foundations and volcanic origins created landscapes that would attract sugar plantations, how the strategic position in the Caribbean made these islands valuable to competing European powers, and how the very winds and waters that seem so peaceful tonight once carried ships laden with human cargo and dreams of fortune. The story of Antigua and Barbuda is, in many ways, a microcosm of Caribbean history itself. It encompasses the complex legacy of indigenous civilizations, the brutal transformation wrought by European colonialism, the profound trauma and resilience of the African diaspora, and the long journey towards self-determination and independence. Yet, it is also a uniquely local story, shaped by the particular geography, ecology, and human decisions that made these islands what they are today. Tonight, as we trace this story together, we'll move slowly through time, allowing each era to unfold naturally. We'll explore how the gentle trade winds that cool the evening air once filled the sails of Arawak canoes and Spanish galleons alike. We'll discover how the coral reefs that now protect these shores from hurricanes once harbored pirates and privateers. We'll learn how the same soil that now nurtures tourism infrastructure once supported vast sugar plantations that shaped the economy and society of the Caribbean for centuries. Our journey will be one of gentle discovery, allowing the peaceful rhythm of historical narrative to carry us forward. We'll pause often to appreciate the human stories within the larger historical movements, to understand how individual lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, and how collective action gradually created the possibility for freedom and self-determination. As you rest tonight, let the story of Antigua and Barbuda wash over you like the gentle Caribbean tide. Feel the warm trade winds of history carrying you from the earliest human settlements through the colonial period and into the modern era. Allow yourself to be transported to sugar plantation houses and sailing ships, to independence celebrations and quiet fishing villages, to the halls of power and the humble homes where ordinary people lived extraordinary lives. The tale we're about to explore is one of resilience, adaptation, and ultimate triumph. It's a story that spans from the earliest indigenous settlements around 3,000 years ago to the vibrant, independent nation that exists today. It encompasses moments of great tragedy and remarkable hope, of exploitation and liberation, of isolation and connection to the wider world. So settle in comfortably, dear listeners, as we begin our peaceful voyage through the historical and geographical landscape of Antigua and Barbuda. Let the gentle rhythm of our exploration carry you toward rest, while your imagination travels across centuries and oceans to these beautiful islands where human stories have unfolded for millennia under the same stars that shine above us tonight. Chapter 2: The Geographic Foundations. As morning light filters across the Caribbean Sea, let us begin our deeper exploration by understanding the very foundations upon which this island story rests. The geography of Antigua and Barbuda tells a tale that stretches back millions of years, a slow and patient story of volcanic fire, coral growth, and the endless dance between land and sea. Picture yourself floating gently above these islands at dawn, watching as the first light reveals their distinctive shapes against the azure water. Antigua, the larger island, spreads before you like an irregular oval, its coastline indented with numerous bays and harbours that would prove so crucial to human settlement over the millennia. Barbuda lies to the north, a flatter, more uniform shape, appearing almost as if the sea had recently released it from its depths. The story of these islands begins deep beneath the ocean floor, in the geological processes that have shaped the Caribbean basin for millions of years. Antigua's foundation was laid by ancient volcanic activity, part of the great volcanic arc that curves through the Lesser Antilles. These volcanic origins are still visible today in the island's western regions, where dark volcanic rocks rise to form the highest points in the nation. Mount Obama, formerly known as Boggy Peak, reaches 1,330 feet above sea level, a modest elevation that nonetheless offers commanding views across the island and out to sea. The volcanic heritage of Antigua created a landscape of gentle diversity. Unlike the dramatic peaks found on some Caribbean islands, Antigua's topography rolls and undulates like a peaceful sea frozen in time. This gentle relief was perfectly suited to the agricultural developments that would later transform the island's economy and society. The volcanic soils, enriched by millennia of weathering, provided the fertile foundation that would support everything from indigenous root crops to the sugarcane that would define the island's colonial period. Moving northward to Barbuda, we encounter a completely different geological story. This smaller island tells a tale written not in volcanic fire, but in the patient accumulation of marine life over countless generations. Barbuda is composed primarily of coral limestone, built up gradually as ancient coral reefs grew and died, their calcified remains slowly forming the foundation of land. This coral limestone gives Barbuda its characteristic low profile, rarely rising more than 100 feet above sea level, creating an island that seems to float just above the surface of the Caribbean Sea. The contrast between these two geological foundations has created islands with distinctly different characters. Where Antigua's volcanic origins provided varied topography and diverse soils, Barbuda's coral limestone created a more uniform landscape, one perfectly adapted to different forms of human activity. The limestone terrain of Barbuda proved less suitable for large-scale agriculture, but created ideal conditions for other pursuits that would shape its unique history and culture. Both islands are blessed with what mariners call a tropical maritime climate, a gentle and consistent weather pattern that has attracted human settlement for thousands of years. The temperature varies little throughout the year, typically ranging from the low 70s to the mid-80s Fahrenheit, creating conditions of perpetual spring that early European visitors would describe as paradisiacal. The steady northeast trade winds, blowing at 15 to 30 miles per hour, provide constant natural air conditioning and helped make these islands appealing to peoples from many different climatic zones. These trade winds carry more than cooling breezes. They have been highways of human migration and cultural exchange for millennia. The same winds that bring relief from tropical heat once filled the sails of indigenous canoes island hopping between South America and the Caribbean archipelago. Later, these winds would guide European sailing ships across the Atlantic, and still later, they would power the sugar mill windmills that dotted Antigua's landscape during the Plantation era. The rainfall patterns of these islands reveal another crucial aspect of their geography. Both Antigua and Barbuda are among the drier islands in the eastern Caribbean, receiving between 30 and 50 inches of rain annually. This relatively low rainfall, combined with the porous limestone of Barbuda and the well-drained volcanic soils of Antigua, created landscapes that were both agriculturally productive and naturally healthy. The dry conditions helped prevent some of the tropical diseases that plagued other Caribbean colonies, making these islands more attractive to European settlement. The coastlines of both islands tell their own geographic stories. Antigua boasts an extraordinary 95 miles of coastline, much of it consisting of pristine white sand beaches that have attracted visitors for centuries. These beaches are not merely beautiful, they represent the intersection of geological processes that span millions of years. The white sand is composed largely of ground coral, parrotfish droppings, and shell fragments, continuously replenished by the constant work of marine organisms and wave action. The numerous bays and harbours that indent Antigua's coastline were carved by the same geological processes that shaped the island's interior. English Harbour, which would later become one of the most important naval stations in the British Caribbean, owes its perfect natural configuration to the interplay of volcanic geology and marine erosion over thousands of years. Similarly, St. John's Harbour, which became the island's primary port and capital, represents a felicitous combination of geographical advantages that human inhabitants would recognize and exploit across many different historical periods. Barbuda's coastline presents a different but equally compelling geographical story. The island is almost entirely surrounded by coral reefs, creating a natural barrier that has protected it from the full force of Atlantic storms, while also making navigation challenging for vessels unfamiliar with local waters. These reefs created ideal conditions for the island's famous lobster fisheries and provided natural protection that would influence Barbuda's unique historical development. The marine environment surrounding both islands extends their geographical influence far beyond their land boundaries. The islands sit on the broad Antigua bank, a shallow underwater platform that encompasses numerous smaller cays and reefs. This marine territory creates an exclusive economic zone of over 42,000 square miles, making the nation's maritime territory vastly larger than its land area. The seasonal rhythms that govern life in these islands reflect their position in the tropical zone, but with important modifications created by their marine setting. The year divides into two broad seasons, a slightly cooler, drier period from December to April, and a warmer, more humid season from May to November. These seasonal patterns would prove crucial to both indigenous agricultural practices and later colonial economic activities. The hurricane season, spanning roughly from June to November, represents perhaps the most dramatic aspect of the island's climate. These powerful storms, born in the African waters far to the east, follow tracks that frequently bring them through the Caribbean archipelago. The same geographical position that made these islands accessible to human migration and trade also placed them in the path of nature's most powerful storms. Hurricane preparedness and recovery have been constant themes in island life across all historical periods. The natural resources available on these islands have shaped human activity for millennia. Antigua's varied geology provided different types of stone for construction, clay for pottery, and soils suitable for diverse agricultural pursuits. Both islands offered access to rich marine resources, from the coral reefs that provided building materials to the fish and shellfish that sustained human populations through many different historical periods. The vegetation that evolved in this geographical setting created landscapes of extraordinary beauty and practical utility. Native trees like the turpentine tree and the white cedar provided materials for indigenous peoples and later colonial settlers. The presence of natural harbours protected by coral reefs, combined with fresh water sources and fertile soils, created the geographical preconditions that would attract successive waves of human settlement. As we drift peacefully through this geographical exploration, imagine the morning mist lifting from these ancient landscapes, revealing contours shaped by fire and water, time and tide. The geographical foundation we've explored tonight provided the stage upon which all subsequent human dramas would unfold. From the earliest indigenous settlements to the modern tourism industry, every chapter of these islands' human story has been influenced by the fundamental geographical realities we've discovered together. Chapter 3: Indigenous Peoples and Early Inhabitants. As the Caribbean dawn breaks gently over waters that have carried human voyagers for thousands of years, we turn our attention to the first peoples who called these islands home. Long before European sails appeared on the horizon, these lands knew the footsteps of indigenous communities whose stories reach back into the deepest currents of American prehistory. The earliest human presence in what we now call Antigua and Barbuda traces back nearly 3,000 years before the Common Era, to a time when the islands were known by names that spoke to their spiritual significance in the indigenous worldview. These first inhabitants were part of what archaeologists term the Archaic period, peoples who arrived not as conquerors, but as patient explorers, island-hopping northward from the South American mainland in skillfully crafted canoes. Picture, if you will, those ancient voyages of discovery, small groups of hunter-gatherers, following seasonal patterns and ocean currents, navigating by stars and seabirds, gradually making their way through the island chains. They travelled in dugout canoes carved from massive trees, vessels sturdy enough to carry families and their possessions across miles of open ocean. These were not desperate refugees, but confident seafarers who understood the rhythms of wind and wave, people who saw the Caribbean not as a barrier but as a highway connecting island communities across hundreds of miles. The archaeological evidence tells us that the oldest major settlement site on Antigua dates to approximately 2,900 years before the Common Era, while Barbuda's earliest confirmed human presence reaches back to around 1,875 years before the Common Era. These dates represent not the beginning of human presence, but rather the oldest sites that have been discovered and systematically studied by archaeologists. The actual human story of these islands likely stretches back even further into periods whose evidence lies buried beneath centuries of subsequent settlement or has been claimed by rising seas. These earliest inhabitants, whom scholars call the archaic peoples, lived lives intimately connected to the natural rhythms of their island environment. They were hunter-gatherers who had developed sophisticated strategies for thriving in the Caribbean island ecosystem. Unlike peoples in larger continental environments, they had to develop ways of life that could be sustained within the limited land area and specific resources available on small islands. The archaic peoples of Antigua and Barbuda left behind stone tools, shell middens, and evidence of their adaptation to island life. They gathered shellfish from the rich marine environment, hunted birds and small mammals, and collected plant foods from the diverse tropical ecosystem. Their lives moved with the seasons and the rhythms of nature, following patterns that would remain remarkably consistent across thousands of years of indigenous habitation. Around the time of Christ's birth, a new wave of indigenous peoples began arriving in the Caribbean, bringing with them revolutionary changes that would transform island life. These were the Saladoid peoples, skilled agriculturalists and ceramicists who had developed along the Orinoco River in what is now Venezuela. They brought with them the knowledge of pottery making, sophisticated agricultural techniques, and complex social organizations that would establish new patterns of Caribbean island life. The Saladoid peoples who settled in Antigua and Barbuda around the 1st century of the Common Era represented a remarkable fusion of South American agricultural knowledge and Caribbean maritime adaptation. They brought with them crops that would become staples of island life: cassava, sweet potatoes, maize, and various beans and squashes. More importantly, they brought the knowledge of how to adapt these continental crops to the specific conditions of small Caribbean islands. The transformation of island life that accompanied Saladoid settlement was profound and peaceful. Rather than displacing the existing archaic populations, the archaeological evidence suggests that the two groups intermingled, creating hybrid cultures that combined the deep local knowledge of the archaic peoples with the agricultural and technological innovations of the Saladoid migrants. This pattern of cultural fusion and adaptation would become a recurring theme in Caribbean history. The ceramic traditions that the Saladoid peoples brought to the islands reveal sophisticated, artistic, and technological capabilities. Their pottery, decorated with elaborate geometric patterns and anthropomorphic designs, served not just practical functions but also spiritual and social purposes. These ceramic traditions provide us with some of our clearest insights into the worldviews and daily lives of pre-Columbian Caribbean peoples. Over the centuries following Saladoid settlement, indigenous culture in Antigua and Barbuda continued to evolve and develop. By around 600 to 900 years after Christ, new cultural patterns emerged that archaeologists term the Late Ceramic period. This was characterized by new pottery styles, changes in settlement patterns, and evidence of increasing contact and trade between different island communities. During this Late Ceramic period, the people of Antigua and Barbuda were part of an extensive Caribbean trade network that connected islands across hundreds of miles of ocean. Archaeological evidence reveals the movement of raw materials and finished goods between islands, stone tools made from materials found on one island but discovered on others, pottery styles that show influence from distant communities, and evidence of shared religious and cultural practices across the Caribbean archipelago. The indigenous names for these islands during this period speak to their significance in the pre-Columbian Caribbean world. Antigua was known as Waladli or Wadadli, meaning our own land in the indigenous language, a name that suggests both belonging and territorial identity. Barbuda was called Waomoni, a name whose precise meaning has been lost but which clearly held spiritual significance for its inhabitants. The social organization of late ceramic period communities appears to have been relatively egalitarian, with leadership based on knowledge, skill, and spiritual authority rather than inherited power. Archaeological evidence suggests communities organized around extended families, with decisions made through consensus and leadership rotating based on circumstances and needs. The spiritual life of these indigenous communities was deeply connected to their island environment. They saw the natural world as populated by spirits and forces that required careful attention and proper relationships. The sea, the wind, the seasonal patterns of birds and marine life, the growth cycles of plants, all of these were understood as part of a complex spiritual ecosystem in which human communities played an important but not dominant role. As the centuries passed, the indigenous peoples of Antigua and Barbuda developed increasingly sophisticated adaptations to their island environment. They created complex agricultural systems that maximized productivity within the constraints of limited land area and seasonal rainfall patterns. They developed methods of food preservation and storage that allowed them to weather difficult periods. They maintained extensive trade relationships that provided access to resources and materials not available locally. By the time of European contact in the late 15th century, the peoples of Antigua and Barbuda had been identified by European chroniclers as belonging to the group they called Arawak. Though this was a European term that lumped together many different indigenous peoples with varied languages, customs, and political organizations, the people themselves had their own names for their communities and identities, names that often reflected their specific relationships to particular islands and territories. The Arawak-speaking peoples of Antigua and Barbuda at the time of European contact lived in communities that combined permanent village sites with seasonal camps that allowed them to exploit different resources throughout the year. They practiced sophisticated forms of agriculture that included the creation of raised fields and careful management of soil fertility. They maintained complex trade relationships and political alliances with communities on other islands. However, by the time Europeans began attempting serious colonization efforts in the 17th century, the indigenous population of both islands had been dramatically reduced. This reduction was caused by multiple factors: diseases introduced by European contact, for which indigenous peoples had no immunity, disruption of trade networks and political relationships, enslavement and forced labor, and direct violence from both European colonists and from Kalinago raids from other islands. The Kalinago, whom Europeans called Caribs, had been expanding their territory throughout the Caribbean in the centuries before European contact. They were fierce warriors who had conquered many formerly Arawak territories, and they continued to raid European settlements and indigenous communities that allied with Europeans. For the indigenous peoples of Antigua and Barbuda, European contact meant not just direct pressure from colonists, but also increased pressure from Kalinago expansion. The last indigenous communities in Antigua and Barbuda disappeared sometime during the 17th century, but their legacy remained embedded in the landscape and culture of the islands. Place names, agricultural techniques, knowledge of local plants and animals, and ways of understanding the island environment all carried forward indigenous influences that would blend with African and European elements in the complex cultural mixture that would emerge during the colonial period. As we rest peacefully tonight, let us remember these first inhabitants, whose footsteps wore the earliest paths across these islands, whose hands shaped the first vessels to carry human hopes across Caribbean waters, and whose voices first gave names to the places that became home to so many different peoples over the thousands of years that followed. Chapter 4: European Contact and Colonial Beginnings. As the morning mist clears from Caribbean waters that once carried the hopes and fears of European explorers, we turn to one of history's great moments of collision between worlds. On a day in late October or early November of 1493, Italian navigator Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown, glimpsed the shores of what he would name Antigua. This moment of first European contact would set in motion changes that would transform not just these peaceful islands, but the entire pattern of Atlantic civilization. Columbus was on his second voyage to what Europeans still believed might be the outer reaches of Asia. Unlike his first voyage, which had taken him to larger islands in the northern Caribbean, this expedition was systematically exploring the chain of smaller islands that curved southward from Puerto Rico. The admiral was seeking gold, spices, and suitable locations for Spanish settlement, but he was also fulfilling the Renaissance dream of scientific discovery and geographic knowledge. When Columbus's fleet approached Antigua on that autumn day over 5 centuries ago, the island presented a vista that would have seemed both exotic and oddly familiar to European eyes. The rolling green hills, the natural harbours, the evidence of agricultural cultivation, all of these might have reminded Spanish sailors of Mediterranean landscapes. Yet the tropical vegetation, the coral reefs visible through crystalline water, and the indigenous peoples who watched their approach from the shore marked this as a completely new world. The Spanish admiral named the island Antigua after the church of Santa Maria de la Antigua in Seville, fulfilling a vow made during his voyage. This naming pattern, connecting New World discoveries to Spanish religious sites, reflected the deeply Catholic worldview that guided Spanish exploration and colonization. For Columbus and his men, claiming territory for Spain was inseparable from claiming souls for Christianity. The initial Spanish encounter with Antigua was brief and relatively peaceful. Columbus's fleet anchored long enough to take on fresh water and make basic observations, but the admiral was eager to continue his exploration southward. The indigenous peoples of the island, members of the Arawak-speaking communities we discussed in our previous chapter, likely watched this strange encounter with cautious curiosity. They had no way of knowing that these visitors represented the advance guard of a transformation that would ultimately reshape their entire world. Spanish interest in Antigua proved to be fleeting. Unlike larger islands that offered obvious signs of gold or silver or strategic locations for major settlements, Antigua appeared to the Spanish as a minor island in an archipelago full of more promising opportunities. Spanish colonization efforts in the Caribbean focused primarily on the larger islands, Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico, where they could establish the kinds of settlements and economic enterprises that would justify the enormous expense of transatlantic colonization. This initial Spanish neglect proved fortunate for the indigenous peoples of Antigua and Barbuda, granting them more than a century of relative autonomy, while Spanish colonization devastated indigenous communities on other Caribbean islands. However, this period of reprieve was far from peaceful. The disruption of traditional trade networks, the introduction of European diseases, and the expansion of Kalinago territorial control all created pressures that gradually weakened indigenous society throughout the region. The Kalinago, whom Europeans called Caribs, had been expanding their control throughout the Lesser Antilles for centuries before European contact. They were skilled warriors and seafarers who had conquered many formerly Arawak territories, establishing a pattern of male-dominated political control, while often incorporating Arawak women and cultural practices into their communities. European contact intensified Kalinago expansion as they sought to maintain their independence and territorial control in the face of European colonization pressure. For over a century after Columbus's visit, Antigua remained largely outside direct European control, though increasingly within the European sphere of influence. Spanish, French, and English ships occasionally stopped for water and provisions, and European diseases continued to reduce indigenous populations, but no European power attempted systematic colonization. The island existed in a kind of liminal space, no longer fully indigenous but not yet fully colonial. This changed dramatically in 1628, when Sir Thomas Warner established the first successful English colony on nearby St. Kitts. Warner's success demonstrated that small Caribbean islands could support profitable English settlements, particularly if they focused on cultivating tobacco and other crops that commanded high prices in European markets. The success of St. Kitts attracted English attention to other islands in the leeward chain, including Antigua. The English colonization of Antigua began in 1632, when a party of colonists from St. Kitts, led by Edward Warner, son of Thomas Warner, established a settlement on the southern coast of the island. This initial settlement was modest, consisting of perhaps 24 families who built a small fort and began clearing land for tobacco cultivation. The colonists chose their location carefully, selecting a site with good anchorage, access to fresh water, and soil suitable for European-style agriculture. The early years of English settlement were precarious and difficult. The colonists faced challenges that were both predictable and entirely novel. They had to adapt European agricultural techniques to tropical conditions, establish trade relationships with indigenous peoples, and defend themselves against Kalinago raids that continued to threaten English settlements throughout the region. The relationship between English colonists and the remaining indigenous population of Antigua was complex and ultimately tragic. Some indigenous people initially allied with the English, seeing them as potential protection against Kalinago raids. These alliances often involved indigenous people, serving as guides, interpreters, and sources of local knowledge that was essential for colonial survival. However, as English settlement expanded and became more confident, these relationships deteriorated into conflict and exploitation. The transformation of Antigua from an indigenous island to an English colony was neither rapid nor complete in its early decades. English settlement remained concentrated in a few coastal areas, while much of the island's interior remained under indigenous control or completely unpopulated. The English colonial population grew slowly, constrained by high mortality rates, limited financial resources, and the constant threat of Kalinago attacks. Barbuda's colonial history followed a somewhat different pattern. The smaller island was claimed by the English at the same time as Antigua, but its coral limestone terrain and smaller size made it less attractive for immediate settlement. Instead, Barbuda became a kind of colonial appendage, used primarily for livestock grazing and as a source of provisions for the more intensively developed colony on Antigua. The early English colonial economy in Antigua was built around tobacco cultivation, following the model that had proved successful on other English Caribbean islands. Tobacco was a labor-intensive crop that required considerable skill to cultivate and process successfully, but it commanded high prices in European markets and could generate substantial profits for successful planters. The early colonists established small plantations along the coastal areas where they could take advantage of good soils and easy access to shipping. However, tobacco cultivation in Antigua faced significant challenges from the beginning. The island's relatively dry climate made it less suitable for tobacco than some other Caribbean locations. Competition from Virginia tobacco and changing European preferences gradually reduced the profitability of Caribbean tobacco. Most importantly, tobacco cultivation required much more labor than the small English colonial population could provide. The labor shortage that plagued early English colonial society in Antigua would ultimately drive one of the most significant transformations in the island's history. Initially, colonists relied on a combination of family labor, indentured servants from England, and indigenous workers. However, European diseases continued to reduce the indigenous population. Indentured servants eventually completed their terms of service, and the demands of tobacco cultivation outstripped the available labor supply. By the 1640s and 50s, English planters in Antigua began importing enslaved Africans to work on their plantations. This development, which we will explore in much greater detail in our next chapter, represented a fundamental turning point in the island's history. The introduction of large-scale slavery would transform Antigua's economy, society, and culture in ways that continue to influence the island today. The English colonial government that developed in Antigua during these early decades followed patterns established on other English Caribbean islands. A governor appointed by the Crown represented royal authority, while an elected assembly of property-owning colonists managed local affairs and taxation. This system balanced imperial control with local autonomy, though it excluded the vast majority of the population, indigenous people, enslaved Africans, and most free people of color, from political participation. The physical transformation of Antigua during the early colonial period was gradual but ultimately profound. English colonists cleared forests for plantation agriculture, built roads and settlements, and constructed the infrastructure necessary for a plantation economy. They established St. John's as the island's primary port and administrative center, taking advantage of its excellent natural harbor and central location on the island's leeward coast. As we drift peacefully towards sleep tonight, let us reflect on this pivotal period when two worlds met on these Caribbean shores. The encounter between European colonists and indigenous peoples in Antigua was part of a much larger historical transformation that connected the Americas to Europe and Africa in new and often tragic ways. Yet it was also a deeply local story, shaped by the particular geography of these islands and the specific decisions made by individual people facing unprecedented challenges and opportunities. Chapter 5: The Sugar Economy and Plantation Society. As dawn breaks over fields that once swayed with sugar cane, we enter one of the most transformative periods in Caribbean history. The shift from tobacco to sugar cultivation in 17th century Antigua would create a completely new form of society, one built upon the systematic exploitation of enslaved African labor and organized around the pursuit of enormous profits from what Europeans called white gold. The sugar revolution that transformed Antigua began in the 1660s and 70s, driven by a combination of economic opportunity and technological innovation that would reshape the entire Caribbean world. Sugarcane, originally domesticated in New Guinea thousands of years ago, had been cultivated in the Mediterranean and Atlantic islands for centuries. However, the development of efficient processing techniques and the expansion of European sugar consumption created unprecedented opportunities for Caribbean planters willing to invest in this demanding but potentially lucrative crop. Picture, if you will, the gradual transformation of Antigua's landscape during these crucial decades. Where once small tobacco fields and provision grounds had dotted the countryside, the vast expanses of sugarcane now stretched across the rolling terrain. The change was not merely agricultural but architectural as well. The sugar economy required massive infrastructure investment. Windmills to power the crushing machinery, boiling houses where cane juice was processed into crystallized sugar, distilleries for rum production, and extensive networks of roads and harbors to move the finished product to European markets. The windmills that came to dominate Antigua's skyline represented a perfect marriage of European engineering and Caribbean geography. The steady trade winds that had carried indigenous canoes and European sailing ships now powered the stone towers that ground sugarcane around the clock during harvest season. These windmills, built from local limestone and coral stone, became iconic symbols of Antigua's plantation economy and remain among the most visible reminders of this transformative period. The sugar plantation system that developed in Antigua was both more intensive and more extensive than the tobacco cultivation it replaced. Where tobacco required careful attention to individual plants and relatively small plots of land, sugarcane demanded vast acreage, enormous labor forces, and complex industrial processing. A successful sugar plantation was not simply a farm but a complete industrial enterprise, combining agriculture, manufacturing, and logistics in ways that were revolutionary for the 17th century. The Codrington family plantation on Barbuda provides one of the most revealing examples of how this new economy operated. Christopher Codrington the Elder, who became governor of the Leeward Islands, established Barbuda as essentially a single, vast plantation devoted to supplying provisions and livestock to support sugar production on other islands. The entire island was leased to the Codrington family by the Crown, creating a unique form of colonial administration where private commercial interests and governmental authority merged completely. Under Codrington management, Barbuda developed a distinctive plantation society quite different from that of Antigua. Rather than intensive sugar cultivation, Barbuda specialized in raising cattle, horses, and sheep, and in growing provisions needed to feed enslaved populations on sugar islands throughout the region. This specialization created a more dispersed settlement pattern and a somewhat different form of slave society, though one still based fundamentally on the exploitation of African labor. The expansion of sugar cultivation in Antigua required massive investments of capital that were beyond the reach of most small planters. The cost of establishing a sugar plantation, purchasing land, building processing facilities, acquiring enslaved workers, and maintaining operations until the first profitable harvest often exceeded £10,000, an enormous sum in 17th century terms. This capital requirement meant that sugar cultivation became increasingly concentrated in the hands of wealthy planters who could afford the initial investment and weather the risks of tropical agriculture. The Codrington plantations, Betty's Hope Plantation, and other major sugar estates that dominated Antigua's economy were backed by English merchant capital and often owned by investors who never set foot in the Caribbean. This absentee ownership pattern meant that day-to-day plantation management fell to resident overseers and managers, creating a colonial society where the ultimate economic power was exercised by people thousands of miles away. The social structure that emerged from sugar plantation society was rigidly hierarchical and based fundamentally on racial categories. At the top of this hierarchy were the white plantation owners and their families, though many of the wealthiest owners actually lived in England and visited their Caribbean properties infrequently, if at all. Below them were white overseers, bookkeepers, and artisans who managed plantation operations and maintained the complex machinery of sugar production. The emergence of a significant free-colored population represented one of the most complex aspects of plantation society. This group included people of mixed African and European ancestry, free blacks who had obtained their liberty through various means, and the descendants of both groups. Free people of color occupied an ambiguous position in plantation society, neither fully accepted by the white elite, nor sharing the legal disabilities of enslaved people, but facing discrimination and legal restrictions that limited their opportunities and political participation. The sugar plantation system created patterns of land use and settlement that transformed Antigua's physical landscape. The most fertile areas were devoted to sugarcane cultivation, organized around the great houses where plantation owners or their managers lived, and the industrial facilities where cane was processed. Workers' housing was typically concentrated in villages or quarters located close enough to the fields for convenient labor mobilization, but far enough from the great house to maintain social and spatial separation. The seasonal rhythms of plantation life were dictated by the sugarcane growing cycle. The crop season, or time of troubles as it was sometimes called, typically ran from January through June, when mature cane had to be harvested and processed quickly to prevent spoilage. During these months, enslaved workers often labored 16 to 18 hours per day, working by moonlight and torchlight to keep the mills and boiling houses operating around the clock. The technical complexity of sugar production required enslaved workers to develop and maintain sophisticated skills. The art of judging when cane juice had been boiled to the proper consistency for crystallization, the engineering knowledge needed to maintain windmill machinery, the agricultural expertise required to maximize cane yields. All of these skills were primarily held by enslaved Africans and their descendants, who had learned through experience and informal training systems within slave communities. The profits generated by Antigua's sugar plantations were extraordinary by 18th century standards. During peak periods, successful plantations might generate returns on investment of 20 to 30% annually, making Caribbean sugar cultivation one of the most profitable enterprises in the Atlantic economy. These profits flowed primarily to English merchants and investors, but they also created wealth for resident planters and supported a complex network of artisans, merchants, and service providers who catered to plantation society. However, the sugar economy was also characterized by extreme volatility and risk. Hurricanes could destroy years of investment in a single night. Fluctuations in European sugar prices could bankrupt even well-established plantations. The constant need to replace enslaved workers, who faced extraordinarily high mortality rates under plantation conditions, represented a continuous drain on plantation capital. Many planters who seemed wealthy during good years found themselves deeply in debt when conditions turned unfavorable. The environmental impact of plantation agriculture was profound and largely irreversible. The conversion of Antigua's landscape to sugar cultivation required the clearing of most of the island's original forest cover. This deforestation, combined with intensive cultivation and the grazing of plantation livestock, led to soil erosion and degradation that reduced the island's agricultural potential over time. The small-scale, sustainable agriculture practiced by indigenous peoples was replaced by an extractive economy that prioritized short-term profits over long-term environmental health. The social world of the plantation era extended beyond the boundaries of individual estates to create a distinctive colonial culture. Plantation society generated its own forms of architecture, cuisine, music, and social customs that blended European, African, and Caribbean influences in complex ways. The great houses built by successful planters represented attempts to recreate English country house society in the tropics, complete with formal gardens, elaborate entertainments, and displays of conspicuous consumption. The churches that served plantation society reflected the religious dimensions of colonial life. The Anglican Church, as the established Church of England, played an important role in legitimizing plantation society and providing spiritual comfort to white colonists. However, enslaved Africans and their descendants developed their own forms of religious expression that combined African spiritual traditions with elements of Christianity, creating syncretic religious practices that would profoundly influence Caribbean culture. The legal framework that supported plantation society was codified in the comprehensive slave codes that defined the rights of masters and the restrictions placed on enslaved people. These codes, based on similar legislation in other English colonies but adapted to local conditions, gave legal sanction to the absolute power that masters exercised over enslaved workers. The code specified punishments for various offenses, regulated the movement of enslaved people, and created the legal infrastructure that made plantation slavery possible. As we rest peacefully tonight, let us remember that the wealth generated by these sugar plantations came at an enormous human cost. The profits that flowed to England and enriched colonial planters were extracted through a system of forced labor that subjected hundreds of thousands of Africans and their descendants to conditions of extreme brutality, exploitation. The beautiful windmill ruins that dot Antigua's landscape today stand as monuments not only to engineering ingenuity but also to human suffering on a scale that challenges our capacity for comprehension. Chapter 6: Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. As the gentle Caribbean breeze carries whispers of countless untold stories, we turn to perhaps the most difficult and essential chapter in the history of Antigua and Barbuda. The experience of enslaved Africans and their descendants shaped these islands in ways that extend far beyond the economic transformation we explored in our previous section. This is a story of unimaginable suffering and remarkable resilience, of systematic oppression and persistent resistance, of human beings who maintained their dignity and humanity under conditions designed to destroy both. The forced migration that brought Africans to Antigua and Barbuda was part of the largest forced migration in human history. Over the course of more than 3 centuries, approximately 12.5 million Africans were transported to the Americas in conditions of unspeakable brutality. Of these, historians estimate that over 400,000 were brought to the English Caribbean colonies, with thousands arriving in Antigua and Barbuda to work the sugar plantations that would generate enormous wealth for European investors. The Middle Passage, as this forced journey came to be known, began in the barracoons and slave castles of West and Central Africa, where European traders purchased human beings who had been enslaved through warfare, kidnapping, or judicial proceedings that had been corrupted by the demand for slave labor. The African men, women, and children who would eventually reach Antigua came from dozens of different ethnic groups and cultural backgrounds. speaking different languages and practicing different religions, united only by their shared experience of enslavement and transportation. The voyage across the Atlantic typically lasted between 6 and 10 weeks, during which enslaved Africans were confined in spaces barely large enough for human beings to lie down. Ship captains calculated that they could maximize profits by packing as many people as possible into their vessels, accepting that mortality rates of 20 to 30% were simply a cost of doing business. Those who survived the Middle Passage arrived in Caribbean ports physically weakened and psychologically traumatized by experiences that defied human comprehension. Upon arrival in Antigua, newly enslaved Africans faced a period of seasoning that was designed to break their will and prepare them for plantation labor. This process typically lasted several months, during which new arrivals were introduced to plantation routines, assigned to work gangs, and subjected to a systematic campaign of physical and psychological control designed to make them compliant workers. The mortality rate during this seasoning period was extraordinarily high, with many survivors of the Middle Passage dying within their first year in the Caribbean. The daily reality of plantation slavery in Antigua was characterized by backbreaking labor performed under constant supervision and the threat of violent punishment. Enslaved people were typically organized into gangs based on age and physical capacity. The Great Gang, consisting of the strongest adults, performed the most demanding tasks, clearing land, planting and harvesting cane, and operating the dangerous machinery of the sugar mills. Older adults and adolescents made up second and third gangs that performed somewhat less physically demanding but still essential work. The working day during crop season often began before dawn and continued until well after dark. Enslaved people worked in the cane fields under the tropical sun, cut and loaded the heavy cane stalks, fed the crushing machinery that extracted cane juice, and tended the fires under the boiling houses where juice was converted to sugar crystals. The work was not only physically exhausting but extremely dangerous. Workers faced constant risks of injury from machetes, crushing machinery, and scalding sugar liquid. The living conditions provided for enslaved people were deliberately kept at subsistence levels. Most plantations provided minimal housing consisting of one-room huts with earthen floors and thatched roofs that offered little protection from tropical weather. Food rations were calculated to maintain work capacity while minimizing costs, typically consisting of imported salt cod and locally grown provisions like yams, plantains, and corn. Clothing allowances were similarly minimal, with most enslaved people receiving only 1 or 2 changes of rough cloth annually. Yet within these conditions of systematic oppression, enslaved communities created rich and complex cultures that preserved African traditions while adapting to Caribbean circumstances. Music, dance, storytelling, and religious practices provided ways of maintaining cultural identity and community solidarity under conditions designed to destroy both. The development of Creole languages that blended African grammatical structures with European vocabulary allowed communication between people from different African linguistic backgrounds while creating new forms of cultural expression. Family relationships represented both the greatest source of strength and the greatest vulnerability for enslaved people. While plantation owners sometimes recognized slave marriages and family relationships when it served their economic interests, they also felt free to separate families through sale, inheritance, or punishment whenever they chose. The constant threat of family separation created a form of psychological torture that was perhaps more effective than physical punishment in maintaining control over enslaved populations. Religious life in slave communities combined African spiritual traditions with elements of Christianity in ways that created new forms of religious expression while maintaining connections to ancestral traditions. While plantation owners sometimes encouraged slave conversion to Christianity as a means of social control, enslaved people developed their own interpretations of Christian teachings that emphasized themes of liberation and divine justice. African-derived religious practices, including ancestor veneration, spirit possession, and traditional healing, continued alongside and often merged with Christian beliefs. Resistance to slavery in Antigua took many forms, from individual acts of defiance to organized collective action. The most common forms of resistance were those that historians call everyday resistance: work slowdowns, tool breaking, feigned illness, theft of plantation property, and the myriad small acts of non-cooperation that made plantation management difficult and expensive. These forms of resistance were often invisible to plantation owners, but represented a constant assertion of human dignity and autonomy. More dramatic forms of resistance included running away, which was extremely difficult on small islands surrounded by water but nonetheless attempted regularly. Successful marriage was rare in Antigua, but the constant attempts to escape represented a powerful form of resistance and required plantation owners to invest heavily in surveillance and punishment systems. Some escaped slaves attempted to reach other islands where they might find refuge, while others tried to establish hidden communities in Antigua's interior hills. The most feared form of slave resistance was armed rebellion. While large-scale slave revolts were relatively rare in Antigua compared to some other Caribbean colonies, the constant fear of rebellion shaped every aspect of plantation society. White colonists lived in perpetual anxiety about the possibility of slave uprisings, and this fear influenced everything from the design of plantation houses to the organization of colonial military forces. The most significant slave conspiracy in Antigua's history was discovered in 1736, when colonial authorities uncovered plans for a major revolt that would have involved enslaved people from plantations across the island. The conspiracy, led by a slave named Court who worked as a carpenter, planned to coordinate simultaneous attacks on plantation houses and the colonial capital, while most of the white population was attending a ball. The plot was betrayed before it could be executed, leading to a massive investigation that resulted in the execution of dozens of suspected conspirators. The 1736 conspiracy revealed both the sophisticated organizational capabilities of enslaved communities and the extreme measures that colonial authorities were willing to take to maintain control. The trials and executions that followed the discovery of the plot were designed not merely to punish the conspirators, but to terrorize the entire enslaved population into submission. Yet the very existence of such a well-organized conspiracy demonstrated that the spirit of resistance could not be eliminated, even under the most oppressive conditions. As the 18th century progressed, opposition to slavery began to emerge within European and North American societies. The intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, with their emphasis on natural rights and human equality, created philosophical challenges to the institution of slavery. Religious movements, particularly among Quakers and evangelical Protestants, began to question whether slavery was compatible with Christian teachings. These intellectual and religious currents gradually coalesced into organized abolition movements that would ultimately challenge the legal foundations of plantation slavery. The success of the Haitian Revolution between 1791 and 1804 sent shockwaves throughout the Caribbean world. The spectacle of enslaved people successfully overthrowing colonial rule and establishing an independent Black Republic challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and the stability of plantation society. Colonial authorities in Antigua and other British Caribbean colonies implemented stricter control measures and increased military preparations in response to fears that the Haitian example might inspire similar uprisings. The abolition of the British slave trade in 1807 marked the beginning of the end for plantation slavery in Antigua. While the Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade did not free any enslaved people, it ended the legal importation of new slaves into British colonies and began a process that would ultimately lead to complete emancipation. The end of the slave trade meant that plantation owners could no longer replace deceased workers with newly imported Africans, creating labor shortages that made the plantation system less profitable. The period between 1807 and 1834 was marked by growing pressure for complete abolition from British anti-slavery organizations, gradual reforms in slave conditions, and increasing resistance from enslaved communities who recognized that freedom was becoming possible. The Reform Bill of 1832, which expanded political participation in Britain, brought to power politicians who were more sympathetic to abolition arguments and less influenced by West Indian planter interests. Full emancipation finally came to Antigua and Barbuda on August 1, 1834, when the British Emancipation Act took effect throughout the British Caribbean. Unlike some other British colonies that implemented a transitional apprenticeship period, Antigua chose immediate full emancipation, freeing approximately 29,000 enslaved people in a single day. This decision was made partly because the island's plantation owners recognized that the apprenticeship system would be difficult to manage, and partly because they hoped that immediate emancipation would create a more cooperative labor force. The Day of Emancipation was celebrated with religious services, processions, and communal gatherings throughout both islands. For people who had been held in bondage for their entire lives and whose parents and grandparents had never known freedom, this represented a transformation that must have seemed almost incomprehensible. After more than 2 centuries of slavery, the descendants of Africans in Antigua and Barbuda were finally recognized as free human beings with legal rights and the possibility of controlling their own destinies. As we drift peacefully towards sleep tonight, let us hold in our hearts the memory of those who endured slavery's darkness and never lost hope for freedom's dawn. Their struggle, their resistance, and their ultimate triumph over one of history's most oppressive institutions reminds us that the human spirit cannot be permanently enslaved, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against it. Chapter 7: Colonial Transitions and Social Change. As the first light of freedom dawned over Antigua and Barbuda on August 1, 1834, the newly emancipated population faced challenges and opportunities that would reshape island society in ways both profound and unexpected. The end of slavery marked not merely a legal transformation, but the beginning of a complex process of social, economic, and cultural change that would define the Caribbean experience for generations to come. The immediate aftermath of emancipation revealed the extraordinary complexity of transitioning from a society based on forced labor to one based on free labor relationships. For the approximately 29,000 people who gained their freedom on that historic August morning, emancipation represented both a moment of triumph and the beginning of a struggle to define what freedom would actually mean in practice. Having lived their entire lives under systems designed to deny their humanity, they now faced the challenge of creating new lives as free people in a society still dominated by their former masters. The response of the newly freed population to emancipation was both practical and symbolic. Many immediately left the plantations where they had been enslaved, not necessarily to go far away, but simply to exercise their new right to move freely. This mobility, denied to them throughout their lives, represented one of the most tangible aspects of their new status. Some walked to neighboring parishes, others visited relatives on distant plantations, and some simply moved to different locations on the same estates where they had lived as slaves. The plantation owners who had dominated Antigua's economy and society faced their own set of challenges in the post-emancipation period. The compensation they received from the British government for the loss of their human property helped cushion the immediate economic impact, but it could not solve the fundamental problem of how to maintain sugar production without forced labor. The 1.5 million in compensation distributed to Antigua's planters represented a significant sum, but it was based on the market value of enslaved people rather than their actual economic contribution to plantation profits. The labor arrangements that emerged in the years following emancipation reflected the complex negotiations between former slaves seeking to maximize their freedom and former masters trying to maintain their economic dominance. Many freed people chose to continue working on the plantations where they had been enslaved, but now as wage laborers with the right to negotiate working conditions and leave if they found better opportunities elsewhere. This created a more flexible labor market, but also introduced new uncertainties into plantation management. The development of a free labor system was complicated by the limited alternatives available to most freed people. Unlike colonies with large amounts of unclaimed land where former slaves could establish independent farming communities, Antigua's small size and intensive agricultural development meant that most land remained under plantation control. This geographic constraint limited the options available to freed people and helped ensure that most would continue to work in the plantation economy, albeit under different terms. Education emerged as one of the highest priorities for the freed population, who recognized literacy and numeracy as essential tools for participating fully in free society. During slavery, teaching enslaved people to read and write had been illegal in most Caribbean colonies, making education both a practical necessity and a powerful symbol of freedom. The establishment of schools for the children and adults of the freed population became a central focus of both government policy and community organization. The role of Christian churches in post-emancipation society expanded dramatically as religious institutions became centers not only of spiritual life but also of education, social organization, and community leadership. The Methodist, Baptist, and other nonconformist denominations that had been active in the abolition movement established numerous churches and schools throughout both islands. These institutions provided freed people with organizational models and leadership training that would prove crucial in their efforts to build independent communities. The emergence of a free-colored professional class represented one of the most significant social changes of the post-emancipation period. People of mixed African and European ancestry who had been free before emancipation, along with some formerly enslaved people who acquired education and capital, began to establish businesses, practice law and medicine, and participate in island politics in ways that had been previously impossible. This group would play a crucial role in bridging the social and cultural gaps between the white planter elite and the mass of formerly enslaved people. The economic transformation of Antigua and Barbuda during this period reflected broader changes taking place throughout the Caribbean. The sugar industry, which had dominated the island's economy for 2 centuries, faced increasing challenges from competition with sugar beet production in Europe and changing patterns of global trade. Some plantations abandoned sugar cultivation altogether, while others struggled to maintain profitability with free labor and fluctuating prices. The development of alternative economic activities became essential for both individual survival and the overall economic health of the islands. Small-scale agriculture expanded as freed people established provision grounds and market gardens that supplied local food needs. Fishing, which had always been important for subsistence, became more commercialized as free communities gained control over coastal resources. Craft production, trading, and service industries also expanded to meet the needs of the changing society. The physical landscape of the islands underwent gradual but significant changes during this period. Former slave quarters were abandoned or transformed as freed people moved to establish their own homes and communities. New villages emerged, often centered around churches or schools that became focal points for community life. The great houses of the plantation era began their slow decline as some planters abandoned their estates and others found themselves unable to maintain the lavish lifestyles that sugar profits had once supported. The development of a more diverse and representative political system proceeded slowly and often against the resistance of the white planter elite. The colonial government that had served planter interests during the slavery era was gradually forced to accommodate the interests and demands of the freed population. This process was neither smooth nor complete, but it represented the beginning of a long struggle for political equality that would continue well into the 20th century. Cultural life in post-emancipation, Antigua and Barbuda reflected the complex blend of African, European, and Caribbean influences that had developed during the slavery era, but now found new forms of expression in freedom. Music, dance, storytelling, and religious practices that had been suppressed or hidden during slavery could now be practiced more openly. At the same time, freed people eagerly embraced educational and cultural opportunities that had been denied to them, creating new forms of cultural expression that blended traditional and modern elements. The role of women in post-emancipation society reflected both continuities from the slavery era and new opportunities created by freedom. Women had played crucial roles in maintaining family and community relationships during slavery, and they continued to be central figures in the social organization of freed communities. At the same time, freedom created new opportunities for women to participate in economic activities, education, and religious leadership in ways that had been previously restricted. The relationship between Antigua and Barbuda during this period remained close but developed some distinct characteristics. Barbuda's unique history as essentially a single large plantation owned by the Codrington family created different post-emancipation dynamics. The freed population of Barbuda had to negotiate not only with former plantation managers but also with the continuing claims of the Codrington family to ownership of the entire island. The gradual integration of Antigua and Barbuda into broader Caribbean and Atlantic economic and cultural networks accelerated during the post-emancipation period. Improved transportation and communication connected the islands more closely to other Caribbean colonies and to Europe and North America. This integration brought new opportunities, but also new challenges, as local communities had to compete in larger and more complex markets. As the 19th century progressed, the society that emerged in Antigua and Barbuda bore little resemblance to the rigidly hierarchical plantation society that had existed during slavery. While significant inequalities remained, and while the legacy of slavery continued to influence social relationships, the foundation had been laid for a more diverse, dynamic, and ultimately more just society. The struggles and achievements of the post-emancipation generation created the groundwork upon which future generations would build their own movements toward greater freedom and equality. As we rest peacefully tonight, let us remember this crucial period of transition when the descendants of enslaved Africans began the long and difficult work of building free communities on islands where their ancestors had known only bondage. Their efforts to create schools, establish churches, develop businesses, and participate in political life represented not merely personal advancement, but the foundation of the democratic society that would eventually emerge in independent Antigua and Barbuda. Chapter 8. The path to independence. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the winds of change that had begun with emancipation continued to gather strength across the Caribbean archipelago. In Antigua and Barbuda, the descendants of enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, and European settlers were gradually forging a new society that would ultimately demand the right to govern itself. This journey toward independence would span more than a century, marked by moments of progress and setbacks, but always moving toward the goal of true self-determination. The early 20th century brought new challenges and opportunities that would reshape island society in fundamental ways. The decline of the sugar industry, which had dominated the economy since the 17th century, created both economic hardship and new possibilities for diversification. Some plantations abandoned sugar cultivation entirely, while others struggled to maintain profitability in increasingly competitive global markets. This economic transformation opened space for new forms of agriculture, small business development, and eventually tourism. The First World War marked a significant moment in the development of Caribbean political consciousness. Thousands of Caribbean men, including many from Antigua and Barbuda, volunteered to serve in the British military forces, expecting that their service would earn them greater political rights and recognition as full British subjects. However, the discrimination they faced in military service and the limited political rewards they received upon returning home contributed to growing demands for political reform and self-government. The interwar period witnessed the emergence of organized labor movements that would become crucial forces for social and political change. The working people of Antigua and Barbuda, whether employed on the remaining sugar estates, in the small but growing commercial sector, or in various service industries, began to organize themselves to demand better wages, working conditions, and political representation. These labor organizations became schools for political leadership and organizing that would prove essential to the independence movement. The 1930s brought a wave of labor unrest throughout the British Caribbean that historians often call the labor rebellions. In Antigua, strikes and demonstrations in 1939 brought thousands of workers into the streets demanding economic and political reforms. These protests, led by emerging labor leaders and supported by a broad coalition of working people, marked a turning point in the political development of the islands. The response of the British colonial authorities to these labor rebellions included both repression and reform. While colonial police and military forces were used to suppress strikes and demonstrations, the British government also recognized that some reforms would be necessary to maintain stability in the Caribbean colonies. The Moyne Commission, established to investigate the causes of the labor unrest, recommended significant political and economic reforms that would begin the process of decolonization. There, Cornwall Bird emerged as the most significant political leader of this transformative period. Born in 1810 on St. John's, Antigua, Bird came from humble origins but possessed extraordinary organizational skills and a powerful speaking ability that made him a natural leader of the growing independence movement. His formation of the Antigua Labour Party in 1939 provided the organizational foundation that would eventually lead the islands to independence. The Antigua Labour Party developed as more than just a political organization. It became a mass movement that combined demands for political independence with calls for economic justice and social reform. Under Bird's leadership, the party organized workers, established cooperatives, advocated for education and healthcare improvements, and gradually built the political infrastructure necessary to challenge colonial rule. The Second World War accelerated the process of political change throughout the Caribbean. The war's ideology of democracy and self-determination, combined with the economic and strategic importance of Caribbean colonies to the Allied war effort, created new pressures for political reform. Caribbean leaders argued that if they were expected to support Britain's fight for freedom and democracy, they deserved those same rights for their own peoples. The post-war period brought significant constitutional reforms that moved Antigua and Barbuda gradually towards self-government. Universal adult suffrage, introduced in 1951, gave political power to the mass of the population for the first time in the island's history. This reform transformed politics from a contest among small elites to a democratic process in which all adults could participate, regardless of their economic status or educational background. The establishment of ministerial government in 1956 marked another crucial step toward independence. Under this system, elected representatives took responsibility for specific government departments, gaining experience in administration and policy-making that would prepare them for full independence. Ver Bird became the island's first chief minister, a position that allowed him to begin implementing the social and economic reforms that his party had long advocated. The creation of the West Indies Federation in 1958 represented an ambitious attempt to unite the British Caribbean colonies in a single independent nation. Antigua and Barbuda joined this federation along with 9 other territories, hoping that unity would provide the economic and political strength necessary for successful independence. However, the federation faced numerous challenges from the beginning, including disagreements over economic policy, constitutional structure, and the distribution of political power. The collapse of the West Indies Federation in 1962, following Jamaica's withdrawal, forced Antigua and Barbuda to reconsider their path to independence. While some leaders had hoped that federation would provide the framework for Caribbean independence, its failure meant that each territory would need to negotiate its own relationship with Britain and chart its own course towards self-government. The 1960s and 70s were marked by continued constitutional advance and growing confidence in the island's ability to govern themselves effectively. The achievement of associated statehood in 1967 gave Antigua and Barbuda control over all internal affairs, while Britain retained responsibility for defence and foreign relations. This arrangement provided valuable experience in self-government while maintaining the security of British protection. During this period of associated statehood, significant progress was made in education, healthcare, infrastructure development, and economic diversification. The expansion of tourism began to provide an alternative to the declining sugar industry, while improvements in education created a more skilled workforce capable of participating in a modern economy. These developments strengthened the argument that the islands were ready for full independence. The decision to proceed to complete independence was not taken lightly or without considerable debate. Some islanders worried about the economic viability of such small territories as independent nations. Others questioned whether independence might lead to political instability or economic decline. However, the success of associated statehood and the growing confidence of local institutions gradually convinced most people that independence was both desirable and achievable. The final negotiations for independence involved complex discussions about the relationship between Antigua and Barbuda, both with Britain and with each other. Barbuda's smaller size and different historical development had created some distinct interests that needed to be addressed in the independence constitution. The solution was a federal arrangement that granted Barbuda significant autonomy within the unified state, while maintaining the close historical connections between the two islands. The Independence Constitution, finalized in 1981, established a Westminster-style parliamentary democracy with provisions designed to protect both individual rights and the special interests of Barbuda. The document reflected decades of political development and constitutional experimentation, creating a framework for democratic government that drew on both British constitutional traditions and the unique experiences of Caribbean political development. On November 1st, 1981, Antigua and Barbuda officially became an independent nation within the British Commonwealth. The independence ceremonies, attended by representatives from around the world, marked the culmination of a process that had begun with the first demands for political rights following emancipation nearly 150 years earlier. Fair Bird, who had led the independence movement for over 4 decades, became the nation's first prime minister. The achievement of independence represented more than just a change in legal status. It marked the moment when the descendants of indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and European settlers finally gained the right to determine their own destiny. After centuries of colonial rule, the people of Antigua and Barbuda had earned the opportunity to build their own future on foundations of democracy, justice, and self-determination. As we drift peacefully towards sleep tonight, let us remember this remarkable journey from colonial dependence to independent nationhood. The path was long and sometimes difficult, but it was marked throughout by the determination of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary change. The independence of Antigua and Barbuda stands as a testament to the power of democratic organizing, patient persistence, and the unshakable belief that all peoples deserve the right to govern themselves. Chapter 9: Modern Antigua and Barbuda. As the sun rises on the independent nation of Antigua and Barbuda, we find ourselves in the contemporary era of these Caribbean islands, where the legacies of centuries past blend with the opportunities and challenges of the modern world. The nation that emerged from independence in 1981 has spent the past 4 decades building democratic institutions, developing its economy, and defining its place in an increasingly interconnected global community. The early years of independence were marked by the continued leadership of Vere Cornwall Bird, whose Antigua Labour Party had led the independence movement and who remained Prime Minister until 1994. These formative years of independent governance involved the complex process of transforming colonial administrative structures into the institutions of a sovereign democratic state. The new nation had to establish its own foreign relations, develop independent economic policies, and create the regulatory frameworks necessary for modern governance. The economic foundation of independent Antigua and Barbuda rested primarily on tourism, which had gradually replaced sugar as the island's primary industry during the transition to independence. The natural advantages that had once made these islands attractive to indigenous peoples and European colonizers, the beautiful beaches, the favorable climate, the strategic location, now served as the basis for a tourism industry that would become the backbone of the national economy. The development of tourism in Antigua and Barbuda reflects broader changes in global travel patterns and leisure preferences that emerged in the latter half of the 20th century. As air travel became more accessible and affordable, and as North American and European consumers gained greater disposable income and leisure time, the Caribbean emerged as a preferred destination for vacation travel. Antigua's claim to have 365 beaches, one for every day of the year, became a powerful marketing tool that attracted visitors from around the world. The transformation of the island's economy from sugar plantation agriculture to tourism services required significant changes in education, infrastructure, and social organization. Workers who had once cut sugarcane or worked in processing facilities now found employment in hotels, restaurants, tour operations, and the many service industries that support modern tourism. This economic transition created new opportunities for many islanders, while also creating new forms of economic dependence and social stratification. The development of offshore financial services provided another important pillar of the modern economy. Antigua and Barbuda's political stability, English language legal system, and strategic location made it attractive to international businesses and investors seeking offshore banking and company registration services. This sector grew significantly during the 1980s and 90s, providing government revenues and employment opportunities, while also creating regulatory challenges and occasionally controversial international relationships. The political development of independent Antigua and Barbuda has been characterized by competitive democratic elections and peaceful transitions of power. The Antigua Labour Party, which had led the independence movement, continued to dominate politics through the 1980s and early 90s under Very Bird's leadership. However, the emergence of the United Progressive Party and other opposition parties created a more competitive political environment that strengthened democratic institutions. The Bird family's continued prominence in Antiguan politics reflects both the founders' enormous contributions to independence and the complex dynamics of small island politics, where personal relationships and family networks often play important roles. Lester Bird, son of Vera Cornwall Bird, served as Prime Minister from 1994 to 2004, continuing many of his father's policies, while also facing new challenges in the post-Cold War global environment. The transition of political power from the Bird family to the Baldwin Spencer-led United Progressive Party in 2004 demonstrated the maturity of Antigua and Barbuda's democratic institutions. This peaceful transfer of power, following competitive elections, showed that the nation's democratic foundations were strong enough to accommodate political change while maintaining stability and continuity in governance. Education has remained a central priority for independent Antigua and Barbuda, building on the foundations laid during the colonial period and expanded significantly since independence. The University of the West Indies has maintained a presence on the islands, while the American University of Antigua, established in 2004, has provided new educational opportunities and attracted international students. These educational institutions have helped create a more skilled workforce while also contributing to economic diversification. Healthcare development has been another major focus of post-independence policy. The construction of modern medical facilities and the training of healthcare professionals have improved health outcomes significantly since independence. At the same time, the small size of the population has made it challenging to provide the full range of specialized medical services that citizens of larger countries take for granted. The relationship between Antigua and Barbuda has evolved considerably since independence, reflecting the unique federal arrangement established in the Independence Constitution. Barbuda's special status within the nation provides significant local autonomy while maintaining the benefits of unity with the larger island. However, this relationship has sometimes been marked by tensions over development policies, resource allocation, and the extent of Barbuda's autonomy. Climate change and environmental protection have emerged as critical challenges for modern Antigua and Barbuda. As small island developing states, both islands are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise, increased hurricane intensity, and other effects of global climate change. The nation has become an active advocate for international climate action while also implementing domestic policies designed to increase resilience and reduce environmental vulnerability. The devastation caused by Hurricane Irma in 2017, which severely damaged Barbuda and forced the temporary evacuation of the entire population, demonstrated both the vulnerability of small islands to extreme weather events and the resilience of communities in recovering from such disasters. The rebuilding of Barbuda became a national priority that showcased both the challenges and opportunities of sustainable development in the Caribbean context. Cultural development in independent Antigua and Barbuda has flourished as the nation has gained confidence in its own identity and cultural expressions. Carnival celebrations, calypso and soca music, cricket, and other cultural traditions have been celebrated and promoted as expressions of national identity. At the same time, globalization has brought new cultural influences that have blended with traditional practices to create evolving forms of Caribbean cultural expression. The nation's relationship with the broader Caribbean community has been characterized by active participation in regional organizations and initiatives. Membership in the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, OECS, and other regional bodies has provided opportunities for cooperation on issues ranging from economic development to disaster preparedness to climate change advocacy. Sports, particularly cricket, have played an important role in national life and international recognition. The success of Antiguan and Barbudan cricketers in international competition has been a source of national pride and has helped raise the country's profile on the global stage. The Sir Vivian Richards Stadium, named after one of cricket's greatest players who was born in Antigua, serves as both a sporting venue and a symbol of national achievement. As we conclude our peaceful journey through the history and geography of Antigua and Barbuda, we find a nation that has successfully navigated the transition from colonial dependence to independent nationhood, while maintaining its democratic institutions and cultural identity. The challenges that lie ahead, from climate change to economic diversification to maintaining political stability in an uncertain global environment, are significant, but they are being addressed by a people who have already demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability throughout their long history. The story of Antigua and Barbuda is ultimately one of human persistence and hope. From the earliest indigenous inhabitants who made their homes on these islands thousands of years ago, through the trauma and resistance of the slavery era, to the long struggle for political independence and the ongoing work of building a just and prosperous society, the people of these islands have consistently shown their determination to create better lives for themselves and their children. As you drift peacefully towards sleep tonight, carry with you the inspiring story of these beautiful Caribbean islands and the remarkable people who have called them home. Their journey from indigenous settlement through colonial exploitation to independent nationhood reminds us that human communities, no matter how small or how challenged by historical circumstances, possess the capacity to overcome obstacles and create societies based on freedom, democracy, and human dignity. The gentle trade winds that have blown across these islands for millennia continue to carry the hopes and dreams of the people of Antigua and Barbuda as they face the future with confidence, knowing that their history has prepared them well for whatever challenges and opportunities lie ahead.